Darius Lewis had always enjoyed his morning runs, the rhythmic pounding of his sneakers against the pavement, the crisp morning air filling his lungs, and the quiet hum of a waking neighborhood gave him peace before the chaos of the day. But on this particular morning, something felt off. As he jogged past the rows of well-manicured houses in Oakwood Estates, a place he had called home for the last 5 years, he felt it, the weight of an unseen gaze. His pace faltered slightly, his instincts sharpening. He glanced around, but the streets were mostly empty. A lone dog walker across the street, a parked car with tinted windows. Nothing out of the ordinary. Yet the feeling remained. Shrugging it off, Darius pushed forward, rounding the corner toward the community park. That's when he heard it. The faint creak of a window opening. His eyes flicked toward the sound. Third house on the left. White shutters. A neatly trimmed lawn. And behind the partially open blinds, the unmistakable glint of watchful eyes. Darius had lived here long enough to know that not everyone in Oakwood Estates welcomed him the same way. Most of his neighbors were friendly, exchanging nods or small talk when he passed by. But there were always those few, the ones who clutched their purses tighter when he walked by, the ones who avoided eye contact in the grocery store, the ones who saw his presence as a question rather than a fact. He exhaled slowly, deciding to ignore it. It wasn't the first time someone had stared a little too long. But then, a sharp click. The unmistakable sound of a phone being dialed. Darius's stomach twisted. He had heard that sound too many times before in viral videos. The prelude to yet another suspicious black man call. His heart pounded harder, but not from a run. 30 seconds later, the distant wail of police sirens sliced through the morning air. His chest tightened. They're coming here, and he already knew why. Comment below where you're watching from today. Have you ever experienced an unfair situation like this? Share your thoughts. Darius Lewis had lived in Oakwood Estates for 5 years, long enough to know which neighbors smiled when they passed him and which ones never quite met his gaze. He had moved here for the same reason as most. Quiet streets, good schools, and the promise of a community that valued safety and stability. But for Darius, safety was never just about zip codes and neighborhood watch groups. It was about knowing when to smile just enough to put others at ease, when to dress a little sharper so he didn't seem too casual, and when to make himself smaller in spaces that should have felt like home. Born and raised in Atlanta, Darius had always been taught the importance of working twice as hard for half as much. His parents, both educators, had instilled in him a deep sense of discipline and compassion. Your character will always speak louder than their assumptions, his mother would remind him. It was a lesson he carried into adulthood. Now, at 32, Darius was an architect, balancing long hours at the firm with a passion for community service. Every Saturday, he volunteered at the local youth center, mentoring young boys, many of whom reminded him of his younger self. He helped them with homework, taught them about perseverance, and encouraged them to dream beyond the limits society often placed on them. In Oakwood Estates, he wasn't just another resident. He was a neighbor people could count on. When the Hendersons next door needed help moving their furniture, he was there. When Mrs. Patel's car wouldn't start in the middle of winter, he was the one who gave her a jump. And then there was his morning run. A ritual, a reset. Every day at 6 a.m., before the world fully woke up, he laced up his sneakers and hit the pavement. It was his moment of clarity, a time to think, plan, and breathe. He mapped out designs in his head, replayed conversations from the day before, and sometimes he just let the quiet fill him. But even in the stillness, he was always aware. He knew which streets had the best lighting. He knew never to run too close to driveways, never to pause too long outside a house, and always to carry his phone, just in case he needed to prove he belonged. It wasn't paranoia. It was survival. Because no matter how many friendly waves he exchanged or how many community meetings he attended, there would always be someone who saw him as out of place. And this morning, it seemed, was one of those days. Have you ever been in a situation where you felt out of place despite doing nothing wrong? Share your story below. And don't forget to follow for more real-life suspense stories. The sirens were getting closer. Darius slowed his pace, his pulse hammering in his ears. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting flashing blue and red lights to round the corner. But for now, the street remained quiet. Still, the sound was undeniable. Somewhere nearby, police were responding to a call. Breathe. Stay calm. He had done nothing wrong. Just ahead, he spotted a woman standing on her porch, the same house where he had heard the blinds shift, the same place where he had sensed eyes watching him. She was in her late 50s, her short blonde bob stiff with hairspray, her mouth pressed into a tight, self-righteous line. A phone was clutched in her hand, and though she wasn't speaking anymore, he could see the tension in her posture. Her gaze locked onto him like he was an intruder. Darius recognized her. Everyone in the neighborhood did. Her name was Karen, not just in the meme-worthy way. That was actually her name, Karen Whitmore, president of the Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association. She was the type of woman who sent out strongly worded emails about garbage cans left out too long and complained about certain people lowering property values. She was the type who never acknowledged him at community meetings, whose eyes always flickered with something unreadable when she saw him jogging past her house. And now, she was watching him like he didn't belong. Darius forced a neutral expression. "Morning," he called, his voice even. Karen's lips barely moved. "You live around here?" He exhaled slowly. "Here we go." "You know I do," he said, motioning vaguely toward the street. He wasn't about to give her his exact address, not when she had already made up her mind about him. Karen tilted her head, her grip tightening on her phone. "You were hanging around this house." Darius blinked. "I was running, like I do every morning." Karen didn't respond, but the way she eyed him, scrutinizing, dissecting, made the unease coil tighter in his chest. The sirens had faded now, but the silence that followed was even worse. And then, the unmistakable crunch of tires rolling to a stop. Darius turned. A police cruiser had just pulled up to the curb. The officer inside stepped out, adjusting his belt, his eyes flicking between Darius and Karen. He was young, late 20s, maybe early 30s, with a buzz cut and sharp, assessing eyes. Karen exhaled dramatically, pressing a hand to her chest as if she had barely escaped some kind of danger. "Oh, thank goodness. I wasn't sure if you'd actually show up." Darius's stomach knotted. He had done nothing wrong. But somehow he knew this wasn't going to be that simple. What would you do if you were in Darius's situation? Comment below. And don't forget to follow for the next part of this suspenseful story. Darius had been here before. Not this exact spot, not this exact street, but in this moment. The moment where everything slowed down, where a simple morning routine turned into something else. Something dangerous. The police officer stood a few feet away, one hand resting near his radio, the other lingering on his belt, not on his gun. Not yet. Karen Whitmore was already talking. "I called because I saw him loitering near that house," she said, gesturing vaguely at the home across the street. He kept looking at it, circling back. I didn't know what he was up to." Darius swallowed the bitter taste rising in his throat. He had not been circling any house. He had been running, the same route he'd run for years. The officer, his badge read Patrolman J. Halloway, looked at him. "Sir, do you live in this neighborhood?" Darius nodded. "Yes, a few streets over." "Which house?" He let the question hang for a second. He knew this game. If he gave an exact address, they might call it in to confirm. But if he refused, that would be seen as suspicious. He inhaled sharply through his nose and gave his address. The officer's gaze flickered. Karen folded her arms. "That doesn't explain why you were hanging around that house." Darius turned to her. "I wasn't." He kept his voice calm, even, but his fingers curled into fists. "I run past here every morning, just like today." The officer studied him, as if trying to read between the lines of his answer. "You got ID on you?" Darius exhaled. I don't jog with my wallet. The officer didn't look surprised, but Darius saw the shift, the slight stiffening in his posture. Karen clucked her tongue. See, this is exactly what I was afraid of. Afraid of what? The words were out before Darius could stop them. Karen recoiled, as if he had actually done something threatening. She started, then turned to the officer. There have been break-ins in this area before. Darius clenched his teeth. Not by me. But before he could say it, a voice cut through the air. Darius. He turned. Mr. Patel stood at the end of the sidewalk, his coat hastily thrown over his pajamas, his slippers shuffling against the concrete. His brows were furrowed in concern. What's going on? The officer hesitated, then turned to Patel. You know this man? Patel frowned. Of course I do. He lives here. I see him running every morning. Darius had never been so relieved to see his neighbor. The tension in the air didn't fully ease, but the shift was undeniable. The officer gave Darius another long look, then turned to Karen. Ma'am, it seems like Mr. Lewis does, in fact, live here. Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. I was just being cautious, she murmured. Darius let out a slow breath. The officer turned back to him. You're free to go, sir. Just be mindful, all right? The words made his stomach twist, but he nodded. He didn't miss the way Karen still watched him as he turned to leave. The unease lingers. Darius jogged home, but the usual rhythm of his run had been shattered. His heartbeat wasn't just from exertion anymore. Something about the encounter stuck with him. Karen had been watching him, waiting, and there was something else. The house she had accused him of loitering near hadn't it been empty for months? He slowed to a walk. He wasn't imagining that. He was sure of it. The owners had moved out last winter, and though there had been signs of renovation, fresh paint on the shutters, new grass on the lawn, no one had officially moved in yet. So why had Karen been so adamant that something was off today? Darius shook his head. Maybe she was just looking for an excuse. Maybe she was one of those people who saw a black man in her neighborhood and needed to find a reason for him to be there. But something gnawed at him. As he turned onto his street, he made a decision. Tomorrow morning, he'd run that route again. And this time, he'd pay closer attention. The next morning, Darius woke before his alarm. There was an unease in his chest, a quiet something telling him he couldn't just let it go. By the time he laced up his sneakers, the sky was still dark. He started his run, but his mind wasn't on his breathing or his pace. It was on that house. When he reached the street, he slowed his steps, his eyes scanning the property. The porch light was off. The windows were dark. Everything looked normal. Too normal. And then he saw it. The back gate. It was slightly ajar. Darius frowned. He had run this route so many times, and he knew that gate was always latched. His skin prickled. Karen had been watching the house. Had she seen something she wasn't supposed to? Or had someone been inside? Darius glanced around. The street was empty. His breath came slower now, his instincts whispering that something wasn't right. He should just leave it alone. Go home. Pretend he hadn't noticed. But he couldn't. He took a cautious step forward, his heart pounding. He wasn't about to go trespassing, but he could at least take a closer look. The fence was old, though it's slightly warped from the weather. He leaned just enough to peer past it. Movement. A flicker of something in the backyard. Darius's breath caught. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. Someone was back there. And in that moment, a single question filled his mind. Had Karen seen them first? What would you do if you were in Darius's position? Keep running or investigate further? Comment below. And don't forget to follow for the next part of this chilling story. Darius stood frozen at the fence, his breath shallow. The backyard beyond the warped wooden panels was still, but he knew he had seen something move. His muscles tensed. He wasn't sure if it had been a shadow, a trick of the early morning light, or something much worse. He glanced back at the street. It was eerily quiet. No cars, no morning dog walkers, just the empty house and the unsettling silence stretching between them. Walk away. The voice in his head was firm. This isn't your problem. But another part of him, the part that had spent years navigating the world with caution, with careful calculation, whispered something else. What if someone's in trouble? The thought hit harder than he expected. Karen had been watching this house yesterday. That much was clear. And she had been wrong about him. But what if she had been right about something else? Darius swallowed hard. He had two choices. One, walk away, pretend he hadn't seen anything. Forget the open gate, the flicker of movement, the gnawing feeling in his gut. Two, check it out. His pulse pounded in his ears. There were too many stories. People ignoring their instincts, brushing off warning signs, convincing themselves that what they saw wasn't really anything, only to later regret it. Darius gritted his teeth. You don't have to go inside. Just get a better look. He took a slow, deliberate step toward the gate. It creaked softly as he nudged it open. The backyard was unkempt, grass overgrown, a few weeds breaking through the cracks in the stone pathway leading to the back door. And then, a sound, a faint scrape, like a foot shifting on concrete. Darius held his breath. He wasn't alone. His heartbeat thundered in his chest as he scanned the yard. The windows were dark, the back door closed. The air smelled damp like wet earth and wood. But then there, a shape, barely visible behind the corner of the house. Darius' stomach twisted. Someone was here. His first instinct was to back away, get to safety. But then he heard it. A soft, muffled whimper. Not an animal. Not the wind. A person. His throat tightened. Someone's hurt. He knew, in that moment, that walking away was no longer an option. He took a slow step forward. Hello. The silence stretched. And then movement. The figure shifted, pressing further into the shadows. Darius's pulse skyrocketed. Hey, are you okay? His voice was firm but not aggressive. Another pause. Then finally, a whisper. Help. Darius's breath caught. The voice was small, frightened, a woman's. His hands curled into fists as his instincts screamed at him to leave, to call the cops, to get backup. But the tremor in that one word, help, kept him rooted in place. He forced himself to take another step, and that's when he saw her. She was crouched near the side of the house, half hidden in the shadows. Dark hoodie, jeans that looked torn, not by design but from wear. Her hands were wrapped around her knees, and her face, when she finally looked up, was streaked with dirt. Wide, terrified eyes locked onto his. She couldn't have been more than 18, maybe younger. Darius's stomach twisted. Are you hurt? He asked, his voice softer now. She hesitated. Then, slowly, she nodded. His breath came sharp. Okay, listen, I'm not going to hurt you. But you need help. Do you live here? She shook her head quickly. Darius glanced back at the house, his mind racing. If she wasn't the owner, then why was she here? Who does live here? He pressed. The girl's lips parted. But before she could answer, a sound, a door, the back door. It was unlocking. Darius's blood ran cold. He barely had time to react before the door swung open and a figure stepped onto the porch. A man, tall, heavy-set, wearing an old flannel jacket. And the moment he saw Darius standing there, his expression shifted. Not a surprise, but to something far more dangerous. Darius instinctively stepped in front of the girl. The man's gaze flickered between them. What the hell are you doing here? Darius forced himself to stay calm. He swallowed. I was just passing by. The man's jaw clenched. And that's when Darius saw it. The way the man's fingers twitched, like they were itching to reach for something. Darius's entire body went rigid. Everything in him screamed danger. He didn't know who this man was. Didn't know what was happening here. But one thing was crystal clear. The girl was afraid of him. Darius made a split-second decision. He turned to her and whispered, Run. Her breath hitched. And then she bolted. The man lunged, but Darius was faster. He stepped into the man's path, blocking him just long enough for the girl to disappear around the side of the house. The man swore. What the... Darius didn't wait to see what he'd do next. He ran. His heart slammed against his ribs as he tore down the sidewalk, his legs burning. The girl was ahead of him, sprinting toward the main road. Darius didn't look back. He didn't dare look back. His only goal was to get them out. And then, finally, the street opened up. The first hints of morning traffic. The sound of distant voices. The girl slowed, panting. Darius caught up to her. She turned to him, eyes wide, chest heaving. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, her voice, barely above a whisper, "Thank you." Darius exhaled sharply, his hands trembling. But they were safe. For now. What would you have done in Darius's position? Call the police or keep running? Comment below and let us know. Don't forget to follow for the next part of this incredible true story. Darius's breath was still ragged as he stood on the sidewalk, hands on his knees, trying to catch up with his pounding heart. The girl beside him was trembling, arms wrapped tightly around herself, her chest rising and falling in uneven bursts. She looked like she wanted to disappear into the pavement. Darius stole a glance over his shoulder. No sign of the man. No sound of pursuit. They had made it, but this wasn't over. His fingers shook as he reached for his phone. He was still processing what had just happened, the rush of adrenaline fading into a deeper, sharper realization. That man was dangerous, and she had been trapped. The girl flinched as he unlocked his phone. Her eyes darted to the screen, then up to him. "Are you calling the cops?" she whispered. Darius hesitated. She didn't sound relieved. She sounded terrified. His stomach twisted. He had always been the kind of person who trusted in doing the right thing. But right now, he wasn't sure what the right thing was. Instead of answering, he met her gaze. "What's your name?" She hesitated. "Sienna." "Sienna," he repeated, grounding himself in the sound of it. "I don't know what's going on, but I know you're in trouble, and I want to help." Her throat bobbed. She glanced back toward the empty street, then hugged herself tighter. "I can't go back there." Darius nodded slowly. "You won't." She studied him, searching his face for any sign of deception. Then, finally, she exhaled. "Okay." A safe place. Darius led her to the cafe a few blocks away. It was one of those places where the scent of roasted coffee beans hit you before you even stepped inside, where the barista knew the regulars' names and orders before they even spoke. The moment they walked in, he spotted Lisa behind the counter. Lisa had been working there since before Darius moved into the neighborhood. She was one of those people who had a way of making everyone feel like they belonged, like they were seen. And right now, Sienna needed that. Lisa's brow furrowed as she saw them. "You look like you've been running for your lives." Darius offered a wry smile. "We kind of were." Lisa's eyes flickered to Sienna. She didn't ask questions, didn't press. Instead, she nodded toward the corner booth. "Sit. I'll bring you something warm." Darius guided Sienna to the booth. She sank into the seat, shoulders still curled inward, her gaze flicking around like she expected someone to burst through the door at any moment. A few minutes later, Lisa slid 2 cups in front of them. "Hot chocolate," she said simply. Sienna blinked. "I didn't order." Lisa cut her off with a knowing look. "You looked like you needed it." Sienna hesitated, then wrapped her fingers around the mug. She didn't drink it right away, just let the warmth seep into her hands. Darius waited until Lisa walked away before speaking. "Sienna, who was that man?" She tensed. For a long time, she didn't answer. Then, in a voice so quiet he almost missed it, "My mom's boyfriend." Darius's stomach dropped. He had suspected as much, but hearing it out loud made it real. "He's been," she swallowed hard. "He keeps me there. Doesn't let me leave. Mom works late, So she doesn't see it. Darius's grip tightened around his cup. He knew what she wasn't saying. She didn't have to spell it out for him to understand. And now he knew there was no way he could just walk away from this. Doing the right thing, Darius took a slow breath. Sienna, I need call someone. Panic flashed across her face. No, I can't. I'm not saying we call the police right this second, he interrupted gently. But we need to get you somewhere safe. Somewhere he can't reach you. Her fingers curled around the cup. Darius softened his voice. Do you have any family? Friends? She shook her head. Just my mom. Her voice cracked. And I don't want to get her in trouble. Darius felt something break inside him. She was still protecting her mother, still trying to carry this alone. His jaw tightened. You're not the one who's going to be in trouble. She looked down. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then finally, okay. Darius exhaled. He pulled out his phone and dialed. Not 911. Not yet. He called someone else. Someone who would know what to do. The call that changed everything. An hour later, Sienna sat in the back of a parked car, talking to a woman from a local crisis shelter. Darius stood outside, arms crossed, heart still racing. Lisa was beside him. She had barely asked any questions, just listened, just helped like she always did. You did good, kid, she murmured. Darius swallowed. It didn't feel like enough. That man was still out there. And Sienna's mother, was she safe? Did she even know what was happening? There were too many questions, too many unknowns. But then the car door opened. Sienna stepped out. She looked at Darius, eyes still wary, but lighter. I'm going to be okay, she said, like she was convincing herself just as much as she was telling him. Darius nodded. You're safe now. She hesitated. Then, in a sudden burst of movement, she threw her arms around him. Darius stiffened, caught off guard. Then he let out a shaky breath and hugged her back. The lesson that remained. 2 weeks later, Darius was back on his usual route. But something was different. He wasn't looking at the world the same way anymore. It wasn't just about delivering mail, about going through the motions. It was about noticing. Because that's what had saved Sienna. Someone noticed. Someone cared. And maybe, just maybe, that was all it took to change a life. What would you have done? Would you have stepped in? Would you have ignored the signs? Drop a comment below and let us know your thoughts. And remember, sometimes the smallest act of kindness can save someone in ways you never imagined. At the heart of this story is a simple yet powerful truth. Paying attention can save a life. In a world where people rush through their days, absorb in their routines, it's easy to overlook the quiet signs of distress in those around us. But Darius' story reminds us that vigilance, compassion, and a willingness to act can make all the difference. Too often, we assume that someone else will step in, that it's not our place, not our business. We second-guess our instincts, afraid of overstepping, of misinterpreting a situation. But what if no one else is watching? What if no one else cares enough to act? Sienna's situation was not unique. Every day, people, especially the most vulnerable, face dangers hidden in plain sight. They might be a neighbor, a co-worker, a student in your classroom, or even a quiet teenager who bags your groceries. They might be leaving subtle clues, small cries for help buried beneath forced smiles and hesitant words. The question is, will we notice? Darius wasn't a police officer, a social worker, or a hero in the traditional sense. He was just a regular guy who saw something that didn't sit right and chose to do something about it. And that is what makes the biggest impact, not grand gestures, but the small, everyday decisions to stand up for someone, to listen, to offer a hand when it's needed most. This is the power of community. It's not just about living near each other. It's about looking out for one another. When we create a culture where people feel seen and supported, we make it harder for abuse and neglect to thrive in silence. We create safe spaces where people like Sienna don't have to face their struggles alone. So ask yourself, have you ever noticed someone acting differently and ignored it? Have you ever felt like something was off but hesitated to say anything? What would you do if someone in your own community needed help but was too afraid to ask? Courage isn't just about standing up for yourself. It's about standing up for others when they can't. Next time you notice something that doesn't feel right, don't look away. Lean in, ask a question, offer a hand. Because you never know, you might just be the reason someone finds their way to safety. One small act of kindness, one moment of bravery. That's all it takes to change a life.